So today we're going to dig into this really powerful idea that comes from our source material, the concept of Ukraine as the shield of Europe. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, it's not just about a line on a map. The argument here is that one nation is standing on the absolute front line of a battle for the future of an entire continent. All right, here's how we're going to break this all down. First up, we'll get a handle on what this shields concept is really all about. Then we're going to take a step back in time because the source argues there's a historical pattern that makes this shield so necessary. From there, we'll look at the pretty brutal realities of the modern conflict, then pivot to the Ukrainian response, and finally, we'll talk about what's at stake for literally all of us. So let's jump right into this core idea, the shield of Europe. The source material is really clear on this. This isn't just about soldiers and tanks on a border. It's about a nation standing guard over a whole set of shared ideals that, basically define the continent itself. Okay, so the way this is framed is absolutely key. The argument isn't just that this is Ukraine's fight for survival. It's that this is a defense of the very principles modern Europe was built on. The idea that borders actually mean something, that human rights are universal, and that the rule of law should win out over brute force. But, to really get why a shield like this would even be necessary, our source material says we have to look to the past. The argument is that what's happening today isn't some random out-of-the-blue event. Nope, it's the latest chapter in a story that's been going on for centuries. Which brings us to the big question, right? Why is a shield needed in the first place? Well, the source answers this by looking at how the Russian state has been seen for hundreds of years, and not just by its enemies, but by its own people too. This timeline pulled from the source is, well, it's pretty fascinating. Just look at the pattern. Way back in 1839, a French marquis calls the empire a prison of peoples. Fast forward over a century, and the American diplomat George Kennan talks about this instinctive insecurity that drives it to expand. Then, of course, you've got Reagan's famous evil empire speech. The point here is that for nearly 200 years, the Western view has been remarkably consistent. And this quote from Churchill in 1946 really gets to the heart of the argument. They admire nothing so much as strength and have no respect for weakness. The big takeaway here, according to the source, is that in this worldview, things like diplomacy and goodwill are always going to take a backseat to pure raw power. Weakness is just seen as an invitation. But here's where it gets really interesting. The source argues that the most powerful, most compelling evidence doesn't actually come from outsiders. It comes from inside Russia itself, from some of its most famous thinkers and writers. Just look at these voices from the inside. In the 1800s, you got the philosopher Pyotr Chadiev saying Russia basically contributes nothing but wild arbitrariness to the world. A century later, Nobel laureate Ivan Bunin writes about a bestial cruelty he sees in the national character. And the source is quick to point out these aren't just, cranky complaints. They're seen as diagnoses of a deep destructive impulse in the state itself. And this quote from Alexander Herzen, man, it really sums the whole thing up as the ultimate summary of that view. Genghis Khan with the telegraph. The idea is that the core ambition, conquest, expansion, it never really changes. It's just the tools that get more modern, whether that's a telegraph or a hypersonic missile. All right, so that's the historical backdrop. The big question now is, how does all of this, according to the source, actually play out today? Well, this next part paints a pretty grim picture of the modern reality. The source then lays out this list of what it calls documented acts of state terror. The massacres in Bucha, the absolute leveling of Mariupol, the forced deportation of children, which is what triggered an international arrest warrant, and of course, the deliberate, systematic attacks on civilian infrastructure, like the Kakhovka Dam. And this is a really crucial distinction the source makes. These things aren't presented as isolated incidents or the tragic fog of war. The argument is that they represent a deliberate, systemic state policy of terror, a way of waging war that's encouraged right from the top. But every story of aggression has a counter story of resistance. So the source then shifts gears to what it calls a battle of willpower versus iron, a classic David and Goliath fight between the human spirit and the cold, hard machinery of war. Our source points to these incredible moments that it says basically rewrote the military textbooks. Think about the defense of Kyiv against some of the most elite units in the world, or a country with almost no navy sinking the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. These moments, plus the lightning-fast counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson, are all held up as examples of pure ingenuity and grit, just systematically grinding down a much, much larger force. But the source makes it clear that the fight isn't just happening on the battlefield. It argues that Ukraine's real main weapon is its people. It points to this massive nationwide volunteer movement that's funding everything from drones to medical supplies, and just the sheer resilience of ordinary citizens. This unity is framed as the true foundation of the resistance, something born from what the source calls a physical need for freedom. Okay, so all of this brings us to the final and maybe the most important part of this whole thing. Why should any of this matter to the rest of the world? The source argues that the stakes here are absolutely global, and that the outcome of this conflict will help define the world that we all live in. And the source uses this really powerful analogy to frame the stakes, shield or dagger. The choice is critical. If Ukraine stands as a shield, it defends European borders, upholds international law, and weakens an aggressor. But if it falls, the source warns it will be reforged into a dagger, its resources, its people, all of it absorbed into the war machine, becoming a launchpad aimed right at the heart of Europe. So if you follow that logic, the argument becomes pretty clear. Supporting Ukraine isn't some act of charity. It's framed as the most effective and pragmatic investment in global security you can make. A cold, hard calculation of self-interest, designed to stop a much bigger, much more catastrophic war from happening down the road. And then the source material just lays it on the line. It makes this incredibly stark claim. It says there is only one way to avoid a third world war: to contain and defeat this aggression right here, right now, on the front lines in Ukraine, before it can spread and become unstoppable. And so, in the end, we're left with this massive question that the source puts right in front of us. This whole thing is framed as a fight for the very character of our century. Are we going to live in a world defined by rules and rights, or one governed by brute force? The answer, the source suggests, is being decided as we speak. Thanks for tuning in.